These are the lecture notes for Chapter 34 on digestive systems and nutrition. The four parts or divisions of Chapter 34, first of all, in Section 1, we will briefly go over the digestive tracts of other animals, but we're going to focus on Sections 2, 3, and 4. The human digestive system, digestive enzymes, basically where they're produced and what types of nutrients that they help to break down. And then nutrition and human health is the last section. So in section 34.1, the digestive system is defined as that it includes all the organs, tissues, and cells involved in ingesting food and breaking it down into smaller components. For example, when we ingest, this morning I ingested a sausage McMuffin from McDonald's, and in the egg and the sausage and the cheese, there was some protein, and those proteins will be broken down into amino acids by enzymes that break down proteins. So enzymes like pepsin and trypsin. Pepsin in the stomach and trypsin in the small intestine. We're not going to go into all that kind of detail, but I had to eat the food, and then now my stomach and my digestion will start in my mouth. The McMuffin part that contains starch, which is a carbohydrate, that began breaking down in my mouth because our saliva produces an enzyme called amylase that breaks down starch into sugar. So they're different components of food are broken down at different points in the GI tract or the digestive tract in humans. So ingesting food, breaking it down into smaller components, and actually absorbing it through the walls of the GI tract into our bloodstream so that those nutrient molecules can get to the cells of our body that need them. So that's really what the digestive system does. It's everything from ingesting all the way to absorbing those nutrient molecules, and then, of course, getting rid of the waste that we're not going to be able to use. So here's a list of what the digestive system does. It ingests food, breaks the food down into small molecules mechanically and chemically, absorbs those molecules, and eliminates the undigestible remains. There are two types of digestive tracts, or like the human digestive tract is called the GI tract for gastrointestinal. If it's an incomplete digestive tract, like the flatworms, for example, planarians and tapeworms, then it's going to have a single opening, and that single opening will serve as a mouth and an anus. And you have a gastrovascular cavity in animals that have an incomplete digestive tract. So we started out with the cnidarians, the jellyfish, and that those animals had a gastrovascular cavity, even though they only had two tissue layers. So the animals that have a complete digestive tract have two openings, a mouth and an anus, and that would include humans. It would also include earthworms. So we're going to focus on the complete digestive tract. And I also want to mention to you about the different modes of nutrition, and animals that are omnivores, carnivores, and herbivores have teeth that are specialized for eating their particular diet. So humans, pigs, raccoons, and most bears are omnivores, meaning that they eat meat and plant material. And their teeth are specialized to accommodate vegetables and meat. So they're going to have the canines, for shredding, and but they're also going to have the flattened molars to help, and the incisors to help. Sorry. my phone, but they're going to have the flattened molars and the to help to break up that plant material, and they're going to have those sharp incisors to help tear the plant material. So incisors for clipping and premolars and molars for grinding. That's what herbivores have. So omnivores are going to have those also. And then carnivores are going to have pointed incisors and enlarged canines. So an omnivore would have, for example, incisors for clipping, but also canines for shredding. So here are some examples. What you can see here is the skull of a horse, which is a herbivore. You can see the incisors for clipping. They don't really need the canines, so they're reduced. And then the premolars and molars are flattened for grinding. And then we have a lion, the skull of a lion, which is a carnivore, and the skull of a dolphin, which is a carnivore. And they have most of their teeth are pointed, and the lion has the enlarged canines, pointed incisors, pointed molars and premolars, and the dolphin has these conical shaped teeth, again for shredding. But a human skull, which is designed for eating meat and plant material, you're going to see the incisors shaped for clipping, plant material, but you're also going to see pointed canines, and then you're going to see for the meat, and then you're going to see the flat molars for grinding. So it's like a combination. Now we're going to move on to section 2 and focus on the human digestive system. The human digestive tract, of course, is complete. There's a mouth and an anus, and then there's a tube all the way from the mouth to the anus. That includes, for example, food goes into the mouth and then through the pharynx or throat, into the esophagus, to the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and then rectum and anus. So the human digestive tract is part of a tube within a tube body plan. The GI tract is a tube, and then it's within the tube we call the ventral body cavity, or our coelom. Our coelom is our body cavity. So let's see. Digestion in humans begins with a mouth, ends with an anus. It's entirely extracellular. It occurs outside of cells. Most of our digestion actually occurs in the lumen of the small intestine, a portion of the small intestine called the jejunum. And the lumen is just the space inside of the small intestine. The small intestine is like a long tube, and inside that tube, that space, that's where digestion occurs. Digestion is mechanical, meaning that we mechanically break down our food into smaller pieces by chewing, and, for example, our stomach churning. And chemical, we break down large molecules into smaller molecules through the action of enzymes. Digestive enzymes are secreted by the wall of the digestive tract or GI tract secretes an enzyme called pepsin, and nearby accessory glands like the pancreas. The pancreas secretes a lot of digestive enzymes and sends them to the small intestines. And then the salivary glands in our mouth secrete a couple of digestive enzymes, lipase for breaking down lipids, and amylase for breaking down starch. Make sure you know the components of the human digestive tract. The salivary glands are one of the, or there's three pairs of them, but they're the accessory organs. They're one of the accessory organs of digestion, and they're found. You have 3 different pairs, so, but they're found in the head. We'll just say that, mostly in the oral cavity, but they're found in the head. And then we have the liver, which is found in the abdominal cavity, of course, the gallbladder, which is attached to the liver, and the pancreas, which is this gland that you see kind of underneath, deep to the stomach. Now, the GI tract begins with the mouth, and then food passes into the pharynx or the throat, then the esophagus, which simply passes the food to the stomach. The stomach is located more on the left side of the upper abdominal cavity, and the liver is located more on the right side. So the stomach and then the small intestines, and they're all folded in here, and then the large intestine, rectum, and anus. Starting with the mouth, this is where digestion begins. Digestion is mechanical by chewing up the food and mixing it with saliva. That mechanically breaks down our food, and it's also chemical. Our salivary glands produce salivary amylase, which breaks starch down into sugars. So going back up in the notes to the roof of the mouth is called the palate. The soft palate is more toward your throat, and the hard palate is actually formed from the palatine bones, which are skull bones, and the hard palate is closer to your teeth. The roof of the roof of your mouth that's made of bone tissue, so it's harder. Okay, so the palate separates the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. And the uvula is the posterior extension of the soft palate, kind of extends into the opening of your pharynx or your throat. There are 3 major pairs of salivary glands, and saliva does contain the enzyme salivary amylase. The tongue is composed of striated muscle, which means that it is voluntary. The movements of the tongue are voluntary, and the tongue helps to mix chewed food with saliva and form it into a bolus. When we swallow the food, we call it a bolus. As the food passes down the pharynx or throat and the esophagus, it's still called a bolus. Once it enters the stomach, it is formed into a mixture called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. So the pharynx is the throat. It is a passageway not only for the digestive system, but also respiratory system. Air and food and drink pass through the pharynx, and then they separate into, the air goes into the trachea and the food goes into the esophagus. So when we swallow, the soft palate closes off the nasopharynx so that food doesn't go up our nose. And the epiglottis covers the glottis, which is the opening to the trachea or windpipe. So the epiglottis is what keeps food from going down the wrong way into our airways. And the food then passes from the pharynx into the esophagus, and the purpose of the esophagus is simply to take food to the stomach. The esophagus contains circular tubes called sphincters that act as valves. So the esophageal sphincter that is at the end of the esophagus as it meets with the stomach. We also call it the cardiac sphincter because sometimes when food backs up into the esophagus due to acid reflux, sometimes that sphincter is weakened. Things that can weaken that sphincter are, for example, being overweight, caffeine, smoking cigarettes. I don't know about vaping, but I think it's the chemicals in the cigarettes, so probably vaping would do it too over time. But anyway, those things can weaken that esophageal sphincter that connects the esophagus to the stomach. Let's find that. Is there a picture anywhere? I'll show you. Let's go back to this one. Here. Okay. The esophageal sphincter would be like, okay, here's your esophagus, and it connects. You can't see it because it's behind the liver, but it connects to the stomach. And right there where it connects, that is where heartburn kind of originates. So here is an illustration of basically our oral cavity and the upper part of our throat, and shows you where the esophagus is compared to the trachea. So food forms into a bolus in our oral cavity, and when we swallow it, The epiglottis kind of covers over the opening to the trachea, covers over the glottis, and food passes into the esophagus and then to the stomach. So this is the bolus of food passing into the esophagus. Now, the wall of the digestive tract has 4 major layers. The inner layer that lines the lumen or the space is called the mucosa because it produces mucus to protect it. And it's folded so that there's more nutrient absorption that occurs there. Then there's the submucosa that's underneath the mucosa. It's a connective tissue. And then there's the muscular layer, which is called the muscularis, and this is smooth muscle that helps move the food along. And then the serosa is the outside, the external layer of the GI tract or the digestive tract.